Hiya. So here we are at the end of our series, How to Fail Well. We've been looking at the book of Jonah and the story of some of the mistakes that Jonah made, but how God restored him in that. And we've thought about how that applies to our own lives with that awareness that we do make mistakes in life. One of the things that is going to happen in life is failure, but how God restores us. And that brings us to that core truth that all of this hangs on, which is that God never fails. God never fails. And that's the idea we want to explore this morning to round this series off. And we're going to do that by looking at one of the Psalms, Psalm 107. Now, this psalm is written about the people of Judah when they were in exile. Judah is one part of the nation of Israel. In Israel's ancient history, they split into two separate kingdoms. Judah was one of them. And the people of Judah found themselves in exile, found themselves away from home, away from everything that made home for them. And so to start with, before we jump into this psalm, I just want us to think about that for a moment. What is it that makes somewhere home? What is it that makes somewhere your home? Why don't you comment on that in the chat right now? Here's something that very much makes home for me. Excuse me, Alfie. Where my dog is. Home is where the dog is. I don't know what things you commented in the chat about what makes home for you, but I guess there's that sense in which home is where everything is just right. Everything is as it should be. And I would argue that home for us is with God. That's what God designed to be our home. Look at where God first placed people, where he first placed mankind. He put them in that Garden of Eden, where everything was just right. Everything was as it should be. Everything was good. And God was there with them. There was one command, of course, that God gave the people in the Garden of Eden, and that was not to eat that fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What that was about was this thing that God had made the garden how it should be. He'd made it just right as their home. He'd set the boundaries of their home in the right places for them. But the people chose not to respect those boundaries. They chose not to trust the definitions, the boundaries of goodness that God had given them as their home, and they ate that fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they decided to define for themselves what was right, what was home, and what wasn't. And of course, as we know, that meant that they had to leave that home. They had to leave that good place where everything was just right, where they were with God. And all the rest of the Bible is the story of how God tries to bring us home. How God tries to bring us home. If we fast forward a little bit to the time of the nation of Israel, the people of Israel rather, in slavery in Egypt, crying out to God. And he says to them, I promise you, I'm going to set you free from this slavery. He does that through Moses, their leader. And I'm going to bring you into a new land, a new home, this promised land where again, everything will be good. Everything will be right. And you can live within the home boundaries that I've set for you again, so that everything will be just right. And I will be there with you. This will be home again. But again, the people don't respect those boundaries that God's given them. They don't follow the commands for what should be right in the place where they are. And as they repeatedly break those commands, as they repeatedly push on those boundaries, they find themselves taken from that home with God into exile, away from home, not where they belong with God. And that's the place that we find the people that this psalm is about, the people of Judah. Now, I would argue that we are still today living in exile. We are still today not home where we belong. Because the place God intended for us as home is that place that's described in the Garden of Eden, where everything is right, where everything is good, where everything is as it should be, and where we are in relationship with God. But as we look at the world around us, that's not how the world looks. We can easily see it's not all right. It's not all good. And it is not all living in good relationship with God. We live in an exile of our own making. Now, hear me right in that. I'm not saying that the difficult circumstances we find ourselves in are always a direct consequence of some specific failure on our part, of something we've done wrong. But rather that because we, mankind as a whole, have consistently failed to live the way that God calls us to. We have consistently pushed those boundaries of what He says is right and good. We find ourselves not in that home of rightness and goodness that He's given us. Bad stuff happens in our world because we are living in exile. But there's hope in this situation because, as I said earlier, God never fails. Whatever the specific circumstances or details of our exile, God can rescue us there. And He never fails in that. So let's hear about how God rescued those people of Judah in their exile. Let's listen to the first part of Psalm 107 now.
Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those He redeemed from the hand of the foe, those He gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and He delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for His unfailing love and His wonderful deeds to mankind. For He satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. Some sat in darkness, in utter darkness, prisoners suffering in iron chains, because they rebelled against God's command and despised the plans of the Most High. So He subjected them to bitter labor. They stumbled, and there was no one to help. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and He saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for His unfailing love and His wonderful deeds for mankind. For He breaks down gates of bronze and cuts through bars of iron. Some became fools through their rebellious ways, and they suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and He saved them from their distress. He sent out His word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. Let them give thanks to the Lord for His unfailing love and His wonderful deeds to mankind. Let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell of His works with songs of joy. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of elders.
I love the way near the beginning of that psalm, it talks about the people from the east and the west, from the north and the south. That's from every direction, making it clear that wherever they've ended up in this exile, wherever they are, however things have ended up, he will rescue them all. God never fails. And the psalm then goes on to describe these four different groups or scenarios, these four different ways in which they find themselves in exile and how God rescues them. I tried to sum each one up with a description of what the feeling, what the emotion was for each of those groups. And so I think the first bit, verses 4 to 9, it's the people who are just feeling lost in their exile. The next bit, verses 10 to 16, is people who are feeling trapped. Verses 17 to 22, people who are feeling ashamed. And finally, in verses 23 to 32, the people who are feeling afraid. Lost, trapped, ashamed, afraid. God steps in each of those situations. God never fails, and he can rescue in each of those. So let's think about each one a little bit in turn. So this first group we find struggling with what's perhaps the most basic consequence, I guess, of being in exile, and that's being lost. You know, when we go to visit somewhere new, these days we'd have a map. We perhaps wouldn't have a paper map like this, we'd probably have it on our phone. But we'd have a map to help us find the way. And I'm guessing these exiles didn't have that map. This fact that they find themselves wandering in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. Prior to them having come into the promised land, that home that God had given them, their nation had spent 40 years already wandering in the deserts on the way. So there's a sense in which I guess they've kind of gone back to this time of wandering. But this time it's different. Before, last time they wandered in the desert, it was on a journey to home, on a journey to this promised land, led by God. Took a while to get there, but they were led by God in it. Whereas now, in this exile situation, they're finding themselves wandering in the desert and they don't know where to go. They don't have that direction. They can't find the way. And it's absolutely clear that a desert wasteland is not a home. It is not a place where you want to stay. It is a place to be travelled through on your way to a home, on your way to a destination. The trouble was that these people couldn't find their way. I wonder if you can relate to that, whether you, living in our exile, have ever found yourself feeling lost, where it feels like you're in a desert wasteland, where you don't feel you've got a community around you to support you. You haven't got those physical things in place to protect you from all of the struggles and the challenges that the world throws at you. And you don't know the direction forwards. You can't see the pathway to a better place, to somewhere to call home. Perhaps you can do what these guys did. It says that they cried out to God. And he delivered them. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. I love the care that he shows them when they cry out. He doesn't, from a distance, say, yeah, go that direction. He leads them along this straight path that takes them right to the city. He doesn't leave them halfway along. He takes them to that city where they can find those things that they need. God rescues them from being lost to led to a new home. And so we come to the next group, these guys who are trapped. It appears that in their exile, these people have found themselves as prisoners, as captives, under some kind of enforced labour. And now, it might seem kind of harsh to us that because they rebelled against God's commands, he's subjecting them to bitter labour. That doesn't seem fair, that they should find themselves enslaved just because they've turned away from God. But let's flick for a moment, excuse me, to Romans chapter 6, where Paul draws out this profound truth. Romans 6, chapter 16, Paul says, "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness." This concept that we are slaves to something. You know, I imagine that these guys, when they were not obeying God's commands, that what they were thinking was that they were choosing some kind of freedom, that they were choosing to be in control for themselves and make their decisions for themselves and be free from all those commands. But actually, the consequence of doing that just leads them to another type of enslavement, enslaved to their own desires, their own whims, their own sinful ways. I wonder if any of us can relate to that. You know, freedom is such a highly valued thing in our society, and we love the idea of being free and being in control of our lives and free to choose who we want to be and what we want to do. But if we think that we truly can choose who we want to be and anything that we want to do, we're actually grossly overestimating the power that we have, because we have human limits. We have our human tendencies. And in choosing not to be slaves to God's way, we're actually just enslaved to the consequences and the habits of our own nature, of our own sinful nature that is flawed. And so I wonder if you've ever gone down a path which you believed was a path to freedom, where you were setting the boundaries for yourself, where you were making your own choices about how you should live and what you should do. And you actually, in the end, found that what you thought was a path to freedom turned out to be a path to slavery, where, having made your own choices, you then actually found yourself trapped and enslaved to something, whether that's an addiction, whether that was difficult circumstances that you were then trapped in and couldn't find a way out of. Maybe like these guys who were enslaved, you can cry out to God. And it says that as that God who never fails, he brought them out of darkness and broke away their chains. When they cried out to God, they went in their exile from being trapped to being free, from darkness to being in the light. Then from verse 17, we've got this group who I've labelled as the ashamed. And I admit I struggle to find the right word to describe this experience. But as we read it, some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. I get that sense reading this, that these are the people who their mistakes are so obviously their own fault. You know, we all accept that we fail in different ways. We all make mistakes. But what can be really awful is when it is so obvious to you that the circumstance you've found yourself in aren't just because you've made an easy mistake to make, but because you've just done something really stupid. You've just been daft and made a really bad choice. And, you know, there's that sense in which you can imagine that feeling of shame that, well, if I share with people this situation I've found them in, is their response going to be, well, what did you expect to happen when you made that choice? How did you expect this to turn out? Of course, it was going to go horribly wrong. That was a really silly thing to do. We all feel shame when we've messed up, but when we've done something really daft, I think that shame weighs particularly heavy. But when these guys cry out to the Lord, it says, He sent out His word and healed them. And I love that God's response to these people is healing, that the cure, if you like, for that shame is healing. I find that so beautiful that, you know, it's not necessarily their circumstance that needs to change. It's not necessarily even their choices and their actions that needs changing by God here. It is something in their hearts, on the inside, that needs His healing. They move from being ashamed to being healed. And finally, we come to this group who I've labelled as those who are afraid. It seems that these guys, these exiles, have been taken onto ships to serve masters on ships. And as they're out there on the seas, they are seeing the awesome power of God as they see the massive storms and the waves. You know, previously they may have thought themselves powerful when they were the great nation of Israel. They might have thought, you know, in deciding their path in life, that they were in control. A bit like Jonah, I guess, when he chose to get on that ship, to choose to steer his path away from God's plan. But now on this ship, they are realising just how awesome God is and how small and powerless they are. And suddenly they realise they don't like going it alone out there in the ocean with its unpredictable highs and lows. I wonder if you've ever set out courageously in your own strength, you know, convinced you can conquer the world. You don't need to submit to God. You can handle this enormous project. You'll make your own decisions. You'll be your own boss. You'll take care of yourself. Which is fine until the storm hits and you find yourself thrown from one side to another, completely out of control, with no idea what's going to hit you next. You know, it is like that stop the world, I want to get off moment. But in that moment, we can cry out to God, as these exiles did. And it says, when they cried out, He stilled the storm to a whisper. They were glad when it grew calm. He guided them to their desired haven. He didn't just calm that storm that they were in, but He took them to their desired haven. He took them somewhere safe. So we've looked at how God rescued these 4 different groups in different circumstances in their exile. But there's 3 more things that I want us to think about. The first thing is this. Each group there in their different circumstance was rescued. But what triggered that rescue? What triggered the turnaround? It was when they cried out to God. And when they cried out to God, He delivered them. He rescued them in exactly the way that they needed to be rescued. When we cry out to God, He never fails. He can rescue us in exactly the way we need to be rescued. No circumstance is beyond His rescue. The second thing is that I want us to remember this is about people in exile, and God here rescued them within their exile. The home where they belonged was in the promised land with God. But when we read of these rescues, it doesn't say that God took them straight back to the promised land. He did eventually, but in this immediate rescue, He rescues them in their exile where they are. God rescues us where we are while we are still in exile. We may not have made it back to the promised land. We may not yet have come fully into His kingdom. But when we cry out to Him, He can rescue us where we are. There will be a time when we return from our exile. Jesus, God's own Son, came into our exile. He came from His home in heaven with the Father to live with us in exile here on earth. And He took all of our exiles upon Himself when He went into the ultimate exile of death. You know, those words He spoke as He died on the cross, we're told He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was separated from His home with His Father at that moment in time. Separated from His Father, but even deeper than that, because Jesus is God, so God the Father and Jesus are one. So it was almost like a separated from Himself, being split apart into exile for us. Jesus went into exile to show us the true way home. We live in exile now. God rescues us while we're in this exile, and He brings little bits of home into this world for us now. But He also promises us that one day we will all be home again. One day we will be with Him in a place like the Garden of Eden, where everything is just as it should be, where everything is right, where everything is good, where everything is secure. But right now, we are still living in the world. We are living in an exile in which God rescues us. And point number 3, the last point I want us to leave with, is that what this psalm we've been reading does is declaring the powerful truths of how God rescued these different groups. The psalm itself says, "Let the redeemed of God say so. Let them thank God." We need that encouragement from each other as we all live in our exile, to hear of how God rescues in every circumstance. And so as we draw this to a close now, we're going to make some space for the redeemed of God to declare the rescue that God has given them through some cardboard testimonies. So allow these testimonies to encourage you and to turn your praise to God.
You unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone. I'm no longer a slave to fear. right through it. My fears are drowned in perfect love. You rescued me and I will